Ethan Marlowe, a powerful, self-made billionaire in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored grey suit, waited in the luxurious VIP lounge of a bustling international airport. His flight was delayed due to a sudden storm, leaving him restless. Ethan had grown used to efficiency and control in every aspect of his life. Nothing went wrong in his world. But as he sat, sipping his coffee, an incident caught his eye that would change his outlook forever. A young African-American woman, no more than 25, was being harassed by an airport security officer. Her suitcase was thrown open, her personal belongings scattered across the floor, while the officer's tone grew sharper, louder. Her tears were evident, but no one stepped in. Ethan felt a surge of anger as he overheard the racial slurs muttered by the officer under his breath. For the first time in years, Ethan was frozen, his heart pounding, unable to look away. Should he intervene? Could he risk the media turning this into a headline, exposing him to the public eye in a vulnerable moment? The tension in the air was palpable. Ethan rushed to help the woman, kneeling beside her as she struggled to collect her scattered belongings. His hand brushed against a small, leather-bound notebook as he gathered up the items, and for a split second, their eyes met. Something flickered inside him, a fleeting, unfamiliar warmth. His mind raced, conflicting thoughts clouding his usually sharp instincts. "What am I doing?" he muttered under his breath, the realization hitting him like a wave. He had spent years avoiding public spectacles like this, knowing full well the headlines that followed every move he made. This wasn't just another random woman in need of help, this was a potential PR nightmare. And yet, despite the danger, he couldn't stop himself. Something stronger than his carefully maintained image of the cold, untouchable billionaire was propelling him forward. He handed the woman her belongings one by one, his fingers lingering slightly on the last item. The tension between them was palpable, though the woman, still dazed, seemed oblivious to who he was. She didn't recognize him, didn't know she was being helped by one of the most powerful men in the country. To her, he was just a stranger in a suit offering her a lifeline in a moment of chaos. The officer who had been standing nearby, watching the scene unfold with growing annoyance, finally approached. His eyes narrowed, his body language radiating authority, clearly irritated by Ethan's involvement. "Sir, I think it's best if you step back," he said in a clipped tone, his patience wearing thin. The tension in the air thickened. Ethan stood up slowly, every inch of his towering frame emanating quiet strength. He adjusted the cufflinks on his custom-tailored suit, his cold blue eyes meeting the officer's with a piercing intensity that sent shivers down the man's spine. Ethan's gaze was unyielding, hard as steel, radiating a silent power that could stop anyone in their tracks. He didn't need to say anything. The raw authority in his presence was enough to make the officer falter. For a moment, no one spoke. The murmurs of the onlookers had died down, replaced by a suffocating silence. The officer hesitated, clearly intimidated by Ethan's commanding presence. His resolve cracked, and he stammered as he tried to form a response, his confidence unraveling under the weight of the unspoken challenge. Finally, the officer took a step back, then another, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Carry on," he muttered before turning and retreating, the crowd parting as he passed. Ethan exhaled, his composure unwavering despite the flood of emotions swirling within him. The woman looked up at him again, her eyes wide with confusion and something else, gratitude, perhaps, but also curiosity. Who was this man who had so effortlessly commanded the situation? But Ethan wasn't thinking about the woman or the officer anymore. His mind was elsewhere, racing ahead, considering the ramifications of what had just happened. He could feel the weight of the stares, the whispers of the crowd. He knew that the story would spread, and soon, the media would come sniffing around for their next scandalous headline. A billionaire caught playing the Good Samaritan, what a juicy story that would make. But this time, it wasn't about the media frenzy, or the headlines, or even the optics. This moment had ignited something deep inside him, a long-buried sense of responsibility, perhaps even guilt. He had spent years building empires, amassing fortunes, and distancing himself from the realities of ordinary life. But here, in this fleeting moment of human connection, something had shifted. Ethan straightened his tie, his mind already formulating a plan. He couldn't just walk away from this. He had to do more than just show up for a few minutes and disappear. This wasn't about saving face or making a headline, it was about something bigger. He glanced back at the woman one last time before turning to leave, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision was already made. He had to take a stand, but the question remained, how? What could a man like him, a billionaire, removed from the struggles of the average person, do to make a real difference? He had money, power, influence, but none of that felt like enough anymore. Not for this. Not for what he was beginning to realize needed to be done. The crowd had begun to disperse, their whispers fading into the background. But Ethan remained rooted to the spot, deep in thought. The old Ethan, the one who would have walked away without a second glance, was gone. Something new was stirring inside him, something that demanded action. His hand unconsciously tightened into a fist, his jaw set with newfound determination. It was time to step out of the shadows and confront the world head-on, no longer just as a businessman, but as something more. Whatever his next move would be, it had to be bold. It had to be meaningful. And this time, there was no turning back. What happens next would leave the world in awe. Aboard his private jet, Ethan stared out the window at the vast expanse of clouds below, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of the woman, crumpled on the airport floor, humiliated and vulnerable in front of strangers. Her face, etched with fear and confusion, lingered in his thoughts. And more than anything, the cruelty she had faced gnawed at him. The officer's harsh tone, the dismissiveness of the crowd, these were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, darker pattern he had seen throughout his life but had distanced himself from. He had climbed so high that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be down there. The memory of his youth came flooding back, crashing into him like a tidal wave. He remembered the long nights sleeping in shelters, the sneers he had endured when he couldn't afford the clothes the other kids wore. He could still hear the whispers of those who looked down on him for where he came from, how he was made to feel like nothing because of his background. Back then, he had vowed to never be powerless again. That vow had fueled his empire, driven him to the top, and shielded him from ever looking back. But now, as he sat in the opulent luxury of his jet, the weight of that vow felt hollow. Yes, he had built an empire from nothing. He had amassed wealth, influence, and power beyond his wildest dreams. But in doing so, he had forgotten where he came from. Forgotten the injustices that had shaped him. He had climbed so far that he had disconnected himself from the very struggles that once defined him. He leaned back in his leather seat, running a hand through his hair, the quiet hum of the engines doing nothing to soothe the storm brewing inside him. This wasn't just about the woman at the airport. She was a symbol, a reminder of something much larger, a world still rife with injustice, where people were mistreated, dismissed, and silenced simply because of who they were. It was the same world he had once fought against, and yet, in his rise to the top, he had become part of the system that perpetuated it. That night, Ethan found himself pacing the aisle of his jet, unable to rest. His mind raced with thoughts, ideas, and a growing sense of responsibility. He had to do something, something meaningful, something that went beyond a token gesture. He reached for his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing the number for his top advisors. It was late, but this couldn't wait. Within minutes, his team had assembled on the line. Their voices crackled through the speakers, some groggy with sleep, others alert and curious about the sudden call. "Ethan, what's going on?" one of them asked. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with a passion they hadn't heard from him in years. "We're going to launch an investigation. I want to know everything about that airport, its practices, its treatment of passengers, its internal policies. But that's just the beginning. I'm not stopping there." There was a pause on the other end of the line, confusion clear in their silence. One of his advisors spoke up cautiously, "Ethan, what exactly are you proposing?" Ethan's eyes hardened with determination. "I want to create a global campaign. We're going to tackle this head-on. Systemic racism, discrimination in corporations, institutions, it's time to take it apart, piece by piece. We'll start with the airport, but this will be an international movement. We're going to change the way the world does business." The reaction from his team was immediate. Some were stunned into silence, while others voiced their concerns. "Ethan, this is massive. You'll be stepping into a political minefield. It's going to be controversial. There's a real risk you could alienate clients, lose investors. This could affect the entire company. Ethan listened but was unmoved. I know the risks. I've taken them before, and I'll take them again. But this isn't about money. Not this time. It's about doing what's right. We can't just keep ignoring it. We're in a position to make a real difference. And I'm willing to bet everything on this. The storm outside his jet intensified, flashes of lightning illuminating the dark sky, but the storm inside Ethan was fiercer. His advisors continued to express their doubts, warning him of the dangers, the potential backlash. But Ethan had already made up his mind. This wasn't a decision based on profit margins or market trends, it was something far deeper. This is a risk worth taking, he said, his voice resolute. We've spent years building wealth, power, and influence. Now it's time to use it for something that matters. If we lose clients, so be it. If investors pull out, I'll find new ones. But we're not backing down from this. As the plane took off, the turbulence shook the cabin, but Ethan sat still, his mind clearer than it had been in a long time. He had spent his entire life fighting for his place at the table, proving that he was worthy of being there. But now, it wasn't about his place, it was about the millions of others who had been denied theirs. The journey ahead would be long, and the road fraught with challenges. But Ethan was no stranger to adversity. He had faced it all before and emerged stronger. And now, with the full force of his empire behind him, he was ready to face it again. Weeks later, the world woke up to shocking headlines. Ethan Marlowe had not only exposed the racist practices at the airport, but he had also bought a majority stake in the company running it. He had fired the security officer, replaced the management team, and initiated training programs that set new standards for racial equity and human rights. Social media exploded with debates, praise, and outrage. News channels couldn't stop discussing it. Ethan's story was everywhere, and suddenly, he became a polarizing figure. But Ethan remained unfazed by the media frenzy. He had a singular focus now, and no amount of backlash would stop him. The woman he had helped, Amelia, became the face of his campaign. Her bravery and vulnerability spoke to millions around the world. Together, they fought for justice, against all odds. In the months that followed, Ethan's company grew stronger, not weaker. His act of defiance became a symbol of hope. Corporations, institutions, and even governments began to follow his lead, implementing policies that aligned with the change Ethan had sparked. The billionaire, once known for his cutthroat tactics, was now a beacon of hope for many. His transformation from a ruthless businessman to a compassionate leader left the world stunned. But for Ethan, it wasn't about glory. It was about purpose. And as the world watched his next moves, one thing became clear: Ethan Marlowe was no longer just a tycoon, he was a force for change. This time, he wouldn't be fighting for himself. He would be fighting for everyone.